Hello, my name is Kate. Today I'm reading FountainWood by my friend Joel Blackledge. It was published in this book called Gross Ideas. I've chosen this story because it puts into my imagination that just because I'm used to seeing a stereotype, a genre or an idea portrayed in a specific way, it doesn't mean I can't imagine it differently in order to change my own reality. FountainWood. The stranger rode into Fountain on a hot, dry day at the end of summer. No welcome sign met him at the limits, and as he reached the town centre, the road turned from red clay to jaundiced dust. He stepped out at the hotel and gave thanks to the coachman, who carried on down to the saloon for a shot of whisky to tickle his scratching throat. As the stranger approached the reception desk, the hotel proprietor, a man named Pinchbeck, stood stiff as a board in a vague and unpractised attempt at decorum. He disguised as best he could the swift kicks he was delivering beneath the counter to the mangy and hated town cat, whose attentions he could not manage to dissuade. The stranger walked slowly, steps punctuated by the silver cane in his hand, and did not seem to mind that he had caught the eye of everyone who had happened to see the coach arrive. We had cause to stare. People did not visit Fountain. He took a room for an indefinite stay and paid the first month in advance, with coins dropped onto Pinchbeck's desk from such a height that they made a loud clattering noise upon landing. While the stranger was signing the register for the benefit of those who had idled in as much as his own, Pinchbeck asked him what business brought him to Fountain. "I'm in lumber," the stranger replied with a smile, his voice deep and soft, like the stage actors that Pinchbeck had seen touring shows through larger, busier towns. "They building more houses here in Fountain, huh?" Pinchbeck muttered. "No, sir, no," said the stranger. "I'm in lumber. I cut it down and sell it on. I will harvest my lumber here." Here? Pinchbeck looked out of the window at the same view he had faced for most of his adult life, and to his disappointment saw nothing altered. It was still a barren and dusty desert, flat right up to the horizon, peppered with wiry saltbrush and cane collar. The only movement came from buzzards and brown leaves dragged in by the wind that had lived and died in other places, far away. "Mister, there's no trees in Fountain." The stranger made a show of turning himself around on his heels to look out of the window, and then smacked himself in the face with shock. The bystanders invested in the drama, even if they didn't understand it, tutted in pity. The stranger emitted a high gee-whiz whistle and slowly pivoted back to Pinchbeck. "Well then," he said, raising his arms in a shrug, "I guess I'll have to grow some." He made a sweeping motion across the room as if closing the curtain on his pronouncement, and the townsfolk set about murmuring in admiration. Quite overcome by both excitement and irritation, Pinchbeck picked up the cat and threw it clear of the building, where it landed in the dust unharmed, and walked round the hotel to enter again through the back. For the rest of the evening, the stranger held court in the hotel bar, fielding questions from the townsfolk that he sometimes answered at great length and at other times ignored in order to tell a more interesting story. He'd order a whisky shot from Pinchbeck, who acted as the hotel's bartender, as well as its chambermaid and cook, and would begin to nurse it on his way back to his seat near the window. But he was so demonstrative in telling his stories, and filled them with so much detail, that it took him all but 10 minutes to get there. He'd no sooner sit down in his chair than be up again, back to the bar for another shot. The hotel's crowd was larger than usual that night, and a good many of them stayed for another drink until after the stranger had retired to bed. The townsfolk soon learned that the stranger's talk of putting trees in Fountain was no flim-flam. He nailed up a notice in the hotel lobby announcing that he was hiring hands to help plant a circular wood all around the town's perimeter. First, every young man signed up to work, and then every old man. After Mrs. Fortnum was asked to wash the men's overalls, soon the women got jobs too. They'd make the men sandwiches, bring them water, and listen to their complaints about stiff joints in the evenings. Starting at the hotel, the workers moved around the town in an anti-clockwise direction. They dug up the soil, sandy and yellow as it was, turned it, planted the stranger's seeds, and redirected the well water to irrigate the land. Fanned out in rows, they swung hoes and shovels in clashing rhythms that slowed after lunchtimes. The Hoffman kids, who didn't go to school, marched up and down the rows of workers, collecting all the biggest rocks that were thrown up by the ground and cached them in a secret store in the cemetery, where hours were spent arranging and rearranging their booty, according to size, sheen, shape, texture, colour, and any other category they could think of. The stranger would stride along the inner side of the circle, and then the outer, observing the men's work and nodding in encouragement at anyone who happened to catch his eye. Sometimes he would stop and lean back, thumbs hooked into his belt loops. He wore no belt. Everyone felt that this was an enlivening presence, and nobody begrudged him the work. As the vanguard of diggers curved past the hardware store, they happened upon a buried skeleton that the hot sand had scrubbed clean of flesh and blood. It was taken to Dr. Bean, who identified a bullet hole directly between the skull's two eye sockets. He gave it a shake and could hear the bullet still rattling around inside. He retrieved a reflex hammer from his bureau with a plan to smash the skull and retrieve the bullet, but upon raising his hand, the doctor was reminded of a porcelain piggy bank he kept as a child and found the act distasteful. The unknown corpse was designated a victim of murder and was taken to Sheriff Tawney. Tawney saw the bullet hole and straight away arrested Kid Costello, who everyone knew was the only person in Fountain capable of such a skillful shot. Kid's defence was the same as what made him guilty. Everyone knew that only he could make that shot. If he were to kill somebody, he argued, and bury them behind the hardware store, he'd make sure not to let on that he was the killer. He'd aim a little off, planting the bullet in the chin or the cheek. That was good enough for the sheriff. The gunslinger was set free, and anyway, it was generally agreed that if he caught a bullet from Kid Costello, he must have done something. The trees were planted in no time. There was nothing to speak to them but a brownish ring of dirt around the whole town, like someone had drawn their finger through treacle. But the stranger, for that's what everyone called him, even though we all knew his name by then, kept up the town's hope and imagination by telling stories of forests the world over. He'd visited forests in Europe where the fog is so dense you risk walking into a tree with every step, and forests in South America where you could never tell the difference between a leaf and a live insect. In some forests it's that hot, the trees sweat more than men, and others are so thick with branches that a skillful climber can cross the whole breadth of the place without even touching the ground. "Sun and water, boys, sun and water," he'd call from his chair by the hotel window, cradling the whiskey glass in his long fingers, laughing to himself at the vision of all those trees waiting under the ground to pop up and surround the town. The townsfolk told him that it never did rain in Fountain, not because he didn't already know, but because they were eager for an explanation. He said to make sure the well water irrigated the land as a priority. The people of Fountain understood sacrifice better than most, and as they cut back on baths and stopped washing their windows, no word of complaint crossed their lips. This how he spent his days, sitting by Pinchbeck's window, drinking coffee till 3 and whiskey after, fielding visits from the workers to talk about water stores and soil density and weather forecasts. Even the townsfolk not in his employ paid visits on him, and he never refused a question, no matter how simple it must have seemed to a worldly man like him. How does a tree know when to stop growing? Will the leaves need to be swept? Are the trees generally cooperative, or do they fight? Days passed after days, and the trees did not fail to grow. That oatmeal land around the town became spotted with green only a little more every day, so that to the Paley brothers, who were overseeing irrigation and inspected the furrows daily, there was no dramatic change. But the farrier, Wrexham, who was cynical from the start, was struck dumb in awe one day at the sight of a great green carpet sweeping around his home. Sprouts became seedlings, and seedlings became saplings. Before long, the trees were freestanding and as tall as the average Fountain resident. The Sunday after their supports were taken away, a day of stifling heat and no whisper of wind, Pastor Harper delivered a sermon on the subject of self-reliance. He asked the stranger, whose oratory he well knew outmatched his own, if he wouldn't mind standing to give a few words on the subject. The stranger obligingly rose from his seat and weaved towards the pulpit between the men and women who fanned themselves to keep at bay the Lord's awful heat. He stood before the congregation and smiled, dark eyes twinkling, even as they sat deep in a nest of craggy wrinkles. His grey suit was immaculate, still warm with a waistcoat, watch chain and thick necktie, despite the church's torrid warmth. Like most of the townsmen, he had stopped shaving and wore a bushy beard, to which clung a few parsimoniously applied flecks of pungent oil. His powerful fingers clutched to the lectern at both sides, readying the audience for his open remarks. Then, before the first sound was uttered, he stopped dead and stared agape. When anxious murmurs swept through the crowd, he stepped down from the pulpit and moved to Callie Callaghan, a girl of 6 who sat beside her father, mother and 4 sisters on the front row. "You girl," he said, loud enough for all to hear, "what is that ornament you wear in your hair?" A wave of small creaks passed over the assembly as everyone stretched to get a view of Callie. No reply came, so the stranger spoke again. "Don't be afraid, darling." His hands were wide. "We're in the house of God, a place for honesty. Isn't that so, Pastor?" Pastor Harper, taken by surprise, gave the question artificial consideration, and when he nodded, the stranger had already turned back. Callie Callaghan reached up and gingerly touched the green sprig tucked into her severe parting. "It's a sprig from a tree, sir," she said, her voice small. "My sister said it looked awful pretty and that I should wear it for church." Every Callaghan sister went rigid at the accusation, as none had said such a thing. The stranger gave a thoughtful hum that rumbled in his broad chest, as if weighing up the legitimacy of this answer. He walked up and down the length of the altar now, turning inwards to face the congregation at each end. "And where did you get this sprig?" "From the trees behind our house, sir." The stranger grunted and turned on his heel. "You visited the trees behind your house, part of the juvenile woodland surrounding the entire town, and took a sprig from a tree because it was pretty?" He moved towards Callie. "Now it sits on your head, a piece of the wood outside brought here inside to church on a Sunday as part of your congregational outfit." He had come so close to Callie that she had to tilt her neck backwards to meet his gaze. Mrs. Callaghan, 3 seats down, was frozen in terror and clung to her eldest daughter Nancy, as if to save what she still could from the approaching calamity. "Well?" asked the stranger again, his voice reaching the back of the hall. "Yes, sir," came Callie's answer. The stranger exhaled and stepped backwards. "Yes, and you know there is a word for that." He paused for an age. "Enterprise." He smiled, and the entire room felt such a release of tension that they let forth with a bustling humour and energy, the like of which Pastor Harper would not have managed to conjure in 100 years of Sundays. The stranger picked up Callie Callaghan with one arm and lifted her to his shoulder, on display to the congregation. He paraded a circuit up and down the church aisle, the entire crowd cheering on little Callie and her enterprise. Mrs. Callaghan was weeping into the beard of her husband. When the cheering began to ebb, the stranger would lift the girl even higher and summon it back. Soon he was leading them in a march, first around the church and then around the town, all bodies tramping in a giddy carnival, chanting, "Enterprise! Enterprise!" The party ended up in a hotel, where Pinchbeck poured whiskey into every glass he could find. He even let the cat finish off some of the hominy grits he spilt on the floor, though not without delivering a kick for good measure. The farrier Wrexham suggested, to general assent, that the town of Fountain be renamed enterprise, though no one was to pursue or even mention this plan again. After that, every girl in town wore a sprig in her hair, and not only on Sundays. When the trees were big enough to throw shade, Miss Bellamy, the schoolmistress, would bring the children there to take their classes. What they lost in concentration, she reasoned, they gained in exposure to novel natural phenomena beyond the overly familiar tumbleweed and cacti. They studied hard to tell apart the new plants and sung a rhyme to learn the names of all those flowering shrubs. Boxwood, dogwood, greasewood, leatherwood, rosewood, wormwood, fiddlewood. When the class noticed birds amongst the trees, they began a journal to identify every species. In just 1 month they had logged the scaled quail, the chimney swift, the cinnamon hummingbird, and the buff-coloured nightjar. Some of the students recovered crumbs from their mother's sideboards to surreptitiously feed the animals when they thought their teacher wasn't looking. Flushed with delight, Miss Bellamy went to the stranger to thank him personally for the woodland. It wasn't just for the birds, she said for the first time. It wasn't just for the birds, she said. For the first time, her children could play a real game of hide and seek. The stranger bowed gracefully and suggested that the young woman come up to his room to elaborate upon the benefits of outdoor education. By all accounts, they were busy talking in private for some time. As the forest floor became speckled with leaves, grass, shoots and wood chips, Lyle Paley, one of Fountain's oldest residents, carried his broom and swept a path through the trees so that he might take his evening constitutional on a route that could circumvent the saloon and therefore cultivate a long-promised sobriety. Though a taciturn man by nature, Paley was compelled to talk among the trees to the late Mrs. Paley, to whom the sobriety had been pledged in the first place. When he died, not long after starting this habit, Dr. Bean privately noted that alcohol, for all its ravages, had been the crutch holding the poor man up. The plot reserved by his wife's grave in the cemetery was never filled. The mourning party wondered if, instead, both coffins could be buried in the wood where Paley had liked to walk. Pastor Harper assented, and a service was delivered in dappled spruce shade, sweet with the scent of pine. The wood gave the townsfolk a hitherto unknown civic pride. Fountain had always been somewhere that people happened to live. No one had much reflected on what they thought of the place. The promenade boards were realigned, the hitching posts were sanded smooth, and everyone visited Jones the barber with this or that particular request about how to look a little smarter this weekend. It was common for a crowd to amble over to the wood's western border of an evening to watch the sun set over the barren horizon, its peach light giving a fullness of colour to the trees not seen in the harsh daylight. Pine cones became purple, loose bark was hot red, and when we kicked a trunk to loosen the older leaves, they'd look like golden snowflakes as they fell. The stranger came home to the hotel one evening, trailing a long, yellow measuring tape and smiling to himself. Pinchbeck, whose whiskers were now waxed into a pair of curved antlers, asked him eagerly for the cause of today's celebration. The stranger held up the measuring tape pinched between finger and thumb. 36. He said it like it was a million. That lumber is ready. Pinchbeck simply smiled and scooped up the cat who had acquired both the name Pancho and a taste for hominy grits. Miss Bellamy had worried that encouraging a predator would endanger the town's blossoming bird population, but upon seeing the corpulent cat she was satisfied that Pancho posed no credible threat to any man or beast. Pinchbeck excused himself and carried Pancho behind the hotel to the edge of the wood, where he liked to lift the cat to the different surfaces and note reactions. This evening, though, he was distracted, and simply stroked Pancho's fur in a daze, inspecting the bark of the trees around him, and muttering 36 as a question. Others, strolling through the woods, heard Pinchbeck's mutterings and were chilled by them. The number was passed around town like an incantation, uttered with caution and awe. When Pinchbeck arrived back at the hotel lobby, he was met by half of the town, talking only in small voices and drinking in slow sips. The stranger had laid out the measuring tape across the length of the bar, and when he put down his whiskey, it was on the 36 mark. Now circled by a ring of condensation. He was pretending not to notice the crowd, just as they pretended to talk to each other, while keeping all eyes and ears on the stranger. Finally, he turned on his heel and addressed them. He said, his voice warm, that the next morning he'd be taking a team out to fell every last tree surrounding the town. He then asked who would be the first to join the posse. The men looked at one another, and no one spoke. The stranger shrugged. "A double pay, of course." Pinchbeck said it was time for Pancho's grits, and retreated to the back room. The Hoffman kids, now young men, sniffed and gazed at their feet. Mrs. Callahan tugged at her dress, and her husband stroked his beard. The farrier Wrexham shuffled to the bar and helped himself to a beer. The stranger waited in the silence, then threw up his arms. "Why, it's the finest portion of the work! You ever had the smell of a freshly split cedar log charge up into your nose?" Some of the children said no. When the stranger turned to them with a smile, Miss Bellamy ushered them out, back to their parents' house or just into the street to play. Everyone inside the hotel watched them go. Now the stranger was in the centre of the room, trying to catch the eye of anyone he could. All faces were cast down, and all shoulders were slouched low. Pinchbeck finally emerged from the back room, dabbing his cheeks with a handkerchief. "I believe that if I owned all the hominy grits from here to Jamestown, it would not satisfy the appetite of that cat," he said. "But he is a treasure." At that he covered his face with the handkerchief and disappeared again into the back. Some people were ambling out of the lobby. Kid Costello had moved to the far corner to play a game of solitaire. Finally, the stranger turned his back on the crowd and leaned on the bar with a contemptuous tut. "Well, I had it in my mind that the people of Fountain were cut from an industrious cloth and had vision that extended beyond the meat at the end of their forks." He waited 2 breaths further to see what reaction the remark would provoke. When none came, he picked up his whiskey glass from its place on the measuring tape and cast the drink down his throat in one gulp. Oh! He retired to bed, muttering, "Guess I was wrong." The next morning the stranger woke at dawn and borrowed an axe from the blacksmith's yard. Then he marched out to the nearest part of the forest, not even bothering to follow the path, rolled up his sleeves, spat on his palms, and swung away. His strikes against the trunk sounded like an immense dog coughing up phlegm, and echoed around the whole town. Anyone still sleeping was woken up by the mighty creak the tree made as it collapsed on the floor. Birds cut short their reveille and fluttered away from the noise, searching in vain for another patch of woodland anywhere close by. The stranger took a moment to catch his breath, irritated by the awful, cloying scent of cedar. As he hefted the axe towards the next tree, a hulking shadow crossed his path, thrown long by the sun that still sat low in its rise. Looking for his axe, the blacksmith was the first to come across the stranger's body half an hour later. He ran to get Sheriff Tawney, who moved the body into a wagon and asked Dr. Bean to make an inspection. The stranger had died, axe still in hand, with one circular hole in his cheek, another in the back of his head, and only one tree felled in the whole of FountainWood. Sheriff and doctor both agreed that the stranger had caused his own death by accident when trying to cut down trees alone, probably upset by alcohol or ill temper. They buried him that very afternoon and didn't even bother looking for the bullet lodged in the tree trunk where he was found. Other strangers would come to the town after that. They would always make sure to ask them their business. This requisite satisfied, they could be sure of a friendly welcome in a place known to be pleasing and attractive, if a little lacking in the fierce work ethic that was so prized in other towns nearby. On arrival through the road entering town, they were met with a particularly handsome wooden sign, smelling of cedar, bidding them welcome to the place once called Fountain. There we go, that's the story. So, now the stranger has gone, the school can continue their forest lessons, but I'm wondering, how long would it take you to learn the name of every bird and plant that you see in your garden or local park? And can you name 5 of each? And if you do want to do what Fountain did and turn an area of land you've got into a nice green area, my suggestion is you could leave a patch of lawn without mowing it, and see what pops up. Leave one patch unmown and mow the rest once a month, and you'll get, because I did it in my garden, and now I've got like yellow buttercups, lilac cuckoo flowers, and you can also eat a lot of weeds that grow in your garden. So I eat red clover, purple violets, white daisies, chickweed. I've got plantain leaves and dandelions, and you can eat all of those as long as you check properly, like online, what's safe. They're just delicious. And luckily, I didn't have to step over the sun-baked body of any money-minded business folk for my green treasure trove to stay alive. Thank you for listening. That was FountainWood by Joel Blackledge that I just read, and you can watch and listen to more stories in the 100 Stories Deep series if you subscribe using the link below. Thanks, and goodbye!